Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we are looking at Shinzo Abe's visit to America, which included a major speech earlier before a joint session of the U.S. Congress. At the outset of that speech, in fact, he reminded that his grandfather had been at that very rostrum back in 1957. With us to talk about it from Washington, Bruce Stokes of the Pew Research Center. Also joining us from the U.S. Capitol, Kei Shimizu, who teaches at Columbia University. Here in the studio, we are in the company of Valérie Niquet, senior researcher at the Foundation for Strategic Research, and France 24's Yuka Royer. Just before the break, we were talking about how the Japanese are becoming more involved militarily. A major bill on that score to increase the mandate of the Japanese military is sent to be put before the Diet, the Congress, soon. Now, ironically, the Japanese seem to like their prime minister more than they do his policies. In fact, Bruce Stokes, according to Pew's poll, more Americans are in favor of militarization than Japanese. 47% in the U.S. say Japan should play a more active military role in regional affairs, and only 23% in Japan, Bruce.
That's correct. And so to go back to the point before the break, I think there's a difference here in both Japan and in the United States between elite opinion on this and public opinion. In Japan, clearly the Abe government wants to increase its military role, doing things to make that happen. It does not have the support of the public in that. And even though 47% of Americans would like Japan to play a bigger military role in the region, almost an equal number are not so sure they want Japan to play a bigger military role in the region. So we're kind of divided publicly about this, but clearly the Obama administration would like to see Japan take on more of the burden. I actually, frankly, was surprised at our results because my sense was that Americans being war-weary, and long debate in our country that we do too much and other people don't do enough in terms of the military burden, I would have expected actually more Americans to want Japan to take on more of a role than we actually found in the survey. So I do think that it would be interesting to dig into.
And how do you explain that?
I can't, frankly, other than possibly Americans understand that the challenge that China poses could conceivably lead to war at some point. And a more activist Japan militarily could somehow drag us into something we don't want to get involved in. But again, that's presuming that people have thought this through in a clear way. It's not at all clear that that's the case. And so I think it deserves much more research to figure out why it is that, in fact, we know from other surveys that Americans are much more willing to see Germany take on more of a military role than to see Japan take on more of a military role. And that's an interesting development as well.
Kei Shimizu, we're coming off a year where there was strong tension between Japan and China, most notably over those disputed islands in the East China Sea. And nonetheless, it seems to be toning it down right now. There seems to be there's a negotiation that is now underway. It seems as though cooler heads could prevail.
I certainly think so. I don't know if it's necessarily a result of cooler heads or the recognition that the two countries, Japan and China, have so many mutual interests in a prosperous Asia-Pacific region, in particular economically, that they really cannot risk any kind of military clash that would sort of break or destroy that economic prosperity. Both Japan coming out of, or trying to come out of, a 2-decade-long economic slump, and China trying to keep its economic engine running, so to say, both countries have a vested interest in a prosperous economic relationship between the two. And really, neither leaders of the two countries can risk that falling apart. And I think that if that is what we mean by cooler heads, then I think that this moment of cooling off of the tensions, the geopolitical tensions on these islands, is a sign of that.
Now, explain something to me, because we were talking about public opinion a minute ago, Kay. we saw recent snap elections, which were won handily by Shinzo Abe's party. Yet, surveys show, are you feeling the economic recovery? A resounding no. Do you support easing military restrictions? No as well. Do you support restarting nuclear power? 58% say no. Do you support a planned increase in sales tax? No as well. So how come, I guess, Shinzo Abe is still so popular in Japan?
I think there are two main reasons for that. One is that Japan's opposition party, unfortunately, has been quite weak. And when the Japanese voting population look to their leaders, who could be a potential leader for the country, they have already had it with this revolving door of leaders, prime ministers, over the last decade or so. And in Shinzo Abe, they see someone who will at least give political stability to the nation, something that is fundamentally necessary if economic recovery is to go forward. And so I think that's one reason. And the other is that in addition to not being a real opposition, the LDP is sort of the Abe's party has given all of the choices, that is, all of the policies are included within its so-called election manifesto, without a clear alternative that another party can grasp onto. And so for those two reasons, it's not necessarily, I think, that Abe himself or the Liberal Democratic Party was so popular, as much as it is that they really wanted a strong leader and there was no opposition that they could vote for.
All right, the only game in town, Shinzo Abe, a nationalist who's fond of America. In fact, he mentioned it in his speech. He spent 2 years in the 1970s at the University of Southern California. There he is on the right in that photo. Yuka Hwaye, how's it going to play back in Japan, him giving that speech in English and expressing this fondness for things American?
I think that in the short run, it's going to boost his popularity. But going back to the election, as Professor Shimizu pointed out, it was because of a lack of viable opposition that people massively voted for the ruling party. But at the same time, the ruling party did lose 2 seats. So it was a landslide election victory, but it was not. There was a clear sign that the Japanese public was not all for it.
All right, and not all for it. And again, there is this sentiment, though, that we don't know which way Japan is turning. When you see this reticence when it comes to militarization, despite what's going on with China, how nationalist are the Japanese right now?
Well, we speak a lot about nationalism in Japan. Some Japanese at least would say that it's more a normalization of Japan. You know, a few years ago we talked a lot about Japan as a normal country who has a right to defend itself, for instance, and this is what is sometimes called nationalism. I'm not sure Abe is much more nationalist than all leaders are, especially, for instance, in France or in other countries, or even in the United States. So I think it is much more a normalization of Japan. On a very limited one, by the way. We spoke of the increase of the military budget. It didn't increase for more than 10 years, and the last increase was about 2%, so it's still very low. On the budget, the military budget in Japan now is about $30 billion, when in China it's 146. So one must keep in mind the relative capabilities of both countries. So there were some change in terms of military capabilities, but there are still very limited changes, including the reinterpretation of the constitution, as they say in Japan, to give the right of collective self-defense, but it's still very limited.
All right, and that'll be happening next month when Abe sends legislation to Parliament to allow Japan to ship fuel and ammunition to American units anywhere if national security is at stake. And disputes extend well beyond the seas between Japan and China. Beijing is now building artificial islands in the South China Sea, there's an example of one, to bolster territorial claims and eventually claims on fishing and natural resources. The Philippines, Malaysia, the latest countries to raise fresh complaints over what they consider aggressive maneuvers. And on that score, they have a friend in Washington.
There are some real tensions that have arisen with China around its approach to maritime issues and its claims. They feel that rather than resolve these issues through normal international dispute settlements, they are flexing their muscles.
Bruce Stokes, what do you think of the tone of the U.S. president there?
Well, I think it was understated, but there's no need for the president to throw gasoline on the fire. I think there is some evidence that at least around the Senkakus, these islands are disputed between China and Japan, that there's been a toning down on both sides of that confrontation, even though in the South China Sea, the Chinese seem to be being more aggressive. We did a survey 2 years ago. We asked people, how bad of a problem is our Chinese territorial ambitions? People in Northeast Asia were much more worried than people in Southeast Asia. Last year, we asked the same question, but we said, do you have any fear this could lead to military conflict? And overwhelmingly throughout Asia, people were worried about this being, could lead to the territorial ambitions of China could lead to a military conflict. So this is a very hot button issue for people throughout Asia. And it may be that the Chinese are pulling back a bit around the Senkakus, but it's not at all clear in terms of the issues that affect the Philippines or Vietnam that they pulled back at all.
Kei Shimizu, you were saying a moment ago how money matters seem to trump the security threat in that there's too much at stake. But nonetheless, when you see the way things are developing, what are your thoughts?
I think that Bruce is exactly right, that around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, that there may have been a toning down or cooling off of the conflict, but in many other parts of the seas surrounding China, there are signs that indicate there may be some escalation, at least on the part of the Chinese, to claim greater territorial space.
And if there is that escalation in the South China Sea, far from Japan's territorial waters, will the Japanese step in and help the Americans?
That I can't exactly answer that. I think that what Abe wants to indicate with this visit to the United States and in the joint statement with the United States is that the Japan-U.S. alliance is strong, that Japan is willing and able to come to the U.S. aid should any kind of conflict occur and vice versa, and that they would like to make a joint statement that shows the world, not just its Asian neighbors, but globally, that both nations are committed to peace first and foremost, and that they have shared values, strong shared values, that they would like others to share as well.
Yes, actually, I think that Japan is ready to play a greater security role, including in the South China Sea, but not maybe in a military term. And this security role increased is welcomed by Japan's neighbor in Southeast Asia. But for instance, already Japan is selling Coast Guard boats to the Philippines to improve the surveillance capabilities of the Philippines. So in that kind of non-military capabilities, Japan is increasing its role in terms of security in Southeast Asia also. But I do not see Japan playing a military role directly, especially in the South China Sea. And even around the Senkaku, Japan is very careful to use coast guards to try to stop Chinese incursion in territorial waters around the Senkaku. But it's a strong. I mean, even if it's toned down, the Chinese gesticulations, military gesticulations around the Senkaku put a strong pressure on Japan's capability.
All right, we've talked about Japan's role in the region, China's role in the region. Then there's the United States. Now, 40 years ago this Thursday, it wasn't a pivot to Asia, it was a pivot away from Asia. The fall of Saigon and the disintegration of the U.S.-backed regime in South Vietnam. It was followed by just a matter of days the fall of Cambodia at the time to the Khmer Rouge. 4 decades later, Bruce Stokes, what's America's star power in the region compared to then?
In terms of the appeal of our economy remains strong. One of the reasons that so many nations in Asia want to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, this free trade agreement that's being negotiated, is because they want better access to the U.S. market. Our surveys show that there's a strong appeal of American soft power in the region, in terms of our cultural products, in terms of our scientific products, in terms of our way of doing democracy. So it does seem to me we're in a much better position in the region now than we were 40 years ago in the wake of the Vietnam War.
A much better position now. And how is American public opinion about it, though? And you mentioned that free trade agreement. Is it an issue? Is it something that Americans are seeking?
When we have asked this question, slightly over half the American public support freer trade with Asia, which we then describe to them as the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If you just ask them about the TPP, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. But when you ask about, in principle, they'd like to see more trade with Asia. The reality is, though, the debate in the United States has not been joined yet. So the criticism of it is not widely known yet. When that happens, my guess is the support will go down a little bit because you get into the details and people begin to feel threatened on certain topics. But we do expect to see an agreement between the governments very soon on this Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that means we would move within 3 or 4 months from now, probably 5 months at the maximum, a vote in the Congress. And we'll see whether the United States will be able to join.
Keishimuzu, your thoughts on that?
I'm very much in agreement with Bruce that there is either misperception or lack of information in the vast majority of the public and all the nations involved, in particular in the United States. And I think that our politicians and our president would benefit from making a stronger appeal based on facts about what the free trade agreement really is about and what the real repercussions are for the United States and Japan if the agreement does not go forward. And in particular with issues related to labor and loss of jobs, as well as the myth, so-called the myth of the decline of U.S. power. I think both of these issues can be directly head-on addressed by stronger messages by leaders of both nations about commitment to not just the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement, but a broader commitment to shared values and ideals that are embedded within this agreement.
Valérie Niquet, it sounds like we're much closer to a deal with Asia-Pacific nations than with a deal between the European Union and the United States. There's a free trade agreement being fleshed out there. And here in Europe, there's quite a lot of anti-American sentiment that's attached to the political rhetoric.
Yes, but once again, that's because I think that the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is not only about the economy. Of course, it is about the economy. The Asia-Pacific is a leading part of the world in terms of growth, even now. But it's much more also an issue of strategic balancing vis-à-vis China. And this is why I think both the United States and East Asia-Pacific nations put much more stress on this TPP and are more eager to find a solution. As we can see in Japan, the TPP is not signed yet, but everybody would like it to pass in order to balance growing China, which is frightening everybody in the region.
All right, you mentioned this trade agreement, selling it in terms of China. Yuka Royer, in his speech, we heard Prime Minister Abe say that you should pass this free trade agreement so that we can crack down on people who abuse intellectual property, on lax labor law, and those seem to be direct digs at China.
They do, don't they? But he also made, other sideways jabs at China in terms of its military threat and its overall growing presence and influence in the area. I think that domestically in the Japanese market, there has been strong resistance to the TPP from the agriculture sector, but that's been sorted out now. And I think that differences remain between the United States and Japan over, notably, I think, the automobile sector and agriculture, as I said. These need to be, there are still differences that need to be ironed out, but I think that as far as these two countries are concerned, both understand that there is a loss of mutual benefit in this trade agreement, and that they're going to move forward fairly soon.
Right. Earlier, Kei Shimizu was saying to us that there's too much at stake between China and Japan. It is a rival, but it's also Japan's largest trading partner. And for all the muscle flexing on the high seas we were talking about, look, this is the front page of today's Financial Times. Above the fold, you see, well, pictures of the Obamas and the Abes at the White House. But below it, the main headline is about the worries that Tokyo's big banks must also be feeling about a possible credit bubble bursting in Beijing. Bruce Stokes, it's a rivalry, but it's got nothing to do with the old Cold War.
No, and it doesn't. And I think that the Japanese are deeply embedded in the Chinese economy. They understand that they're vulnerable to any perturbations in the Chinese economy. At the same time, when we asked in our survey last week of the Japanese and the Americans, if you had to choose getting economically closer to China or economically closer to the U.S., the Japanese chose the U.S. The Americans, when you ask them the same question, if they had to choose, chose China. So this is one of the dilemmas we face, is that Americans fear China. They don't trust China, but they're very pragmatic. They believe China is a growing economy and we have to get closer to them economically. The Japanese, I think, are, the publics at least, are far more wary of China and their growing economic dependence on China. And it's one of the reasons that I believe that at the end of the day, the Japanese public will overwhelmingly support TPP.
The Japanese public less pragmatic in its approach than anything?
I'm not sure it's a question of being less pragmatic, but I would like just to add something. The direct investment from Japan to China, the foreign direct investment from Japan to China this year were down more than 50% comparing with last year. So the Japanese wanted to believe in China for a long time, and there is an integration in terms of economic terms, but more and more they are looking to other places to put their money for instance, Southeast Asia or India, and this is a sign of the fact that China is, really worrying Japan today, even the economic circles.
Kei Shimizu, your thoughts on that?
I think that that's precisely right, that there is fear and distrust on both ends, and this is precisely what I think the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, is trying to address, to build an institution and infrastructure that allows nations to participate in freer trade, one that is built on mutual trust, with strategic relations, and built on fairness and free trade among all of the participants. And although it is often cast as an agreement that is a strategic answer to China's growing economy, TPP is certainly at least not been closed to the Chinese participation. And I think that with China's economy growing in the size that it already is, it would be pragmatic only for Japan and China to have China join them in this agreement later on down the line.
All right, we'll leave it there. Kei Shimizu, thank you for joining us from Washington. Bruce Stokes as well. I also want to thank Yuka Royer and Valérie Niquet. Stay with us, though. Our Media Watch segment is next. And we're joined by James Creedon. How are you, sir?
Very well, thank you. Just a quick look at some of the reactions online to today's events in Washington. Abe offers eternal condolences to the souls of all American people that were lost during World War II. Congress applauds. A lot of people relaying that information on social media. today under the hashtag Abe in the USA, for example. You also have various other comments such as, well, there was also the issue of a few protests in front of the Congress by Korean Americans. Also, others are about the issue of comfort women ahead of the address. So I suppose the address being used by some to draw attention to these issues, which weren't really a part of the speech at all. Also, CCTV in China relaying comments by Abe regarding the whole issue of comfort women and during the war. So really an eye being cast back to the war in anticipation of Abe's comments about or whether or not he would fully apologise for Japan's role during World War II, which of course he expressed condolences but not a full apology. So elsewhere, other comments on social media: didn't expect Japanese Prime Minister to quote Carl King in his address to Congress, "You've got a friend." This is in a reference to his comments about US aid post-Fukushima to Japan. So a lot of people relaying that particular detail as well. Now, I suppose while a lot of attention was being paid to the war and to the past, I think it was almost a distraction in many ways from what the real issue at hand was, which was essentially trade and trying to, I suppose, confirm the attempt to push through the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But if you look online, Francois, there's actually a lot of sites organising popular opposition to these trade deals, which are seen as good for business but not necessarily good for American citizens. And there was actually one article during that drew a direct connection between what we've been seeing in Baltimore in poverty-linked uprisings or riots, some would say, at the same time as more free trade agreements are being pushed through. And indeed, a few people linked to this article, which has got quite a degree of buzz in the last couple of days, by the Baltimore Orioles, one of their top managers, John Angelos. Now, what he said is, whatever about one night's damage, what I'm more concerned about is the 4-decade history by the American political elite of shipping middle-class and working-class jobs away from Baltimore and towns and cities around the U.S.
Now, the argument over whether these free trade agreements outsource jobs.
That's right. So I think, in fact, you could see as well that President Obama today was deflecting questions about Baltimore and trying to focus on the issue at hand, which was the TPP and Shinzo Abe's visit. So certainly some pointing out what some would say is a contradiction, in the sense that perhaps these two issues have a connection in the eyes of some. But worth checking out some of those websites online, Francois. A lot of websites trying to organise against these free trade agreements, also in Europe against the TTIP, which is the equivalent on this side of
We've seen the same sort of arguments being made on social media. James Creedon, I want to thank you. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.